Welcome to Military Analytics. There is no doubt that the Russian Federation is the most powerful navy in the world, next to the USA, China, and the UK. It is a well-known fact that the US Navy is now by far the most powerful in the world. The balance of power between Russia, China, and the UK may change with the latest developments. In fact, this balance may have changed with the land and sea war that Russia started in Ukraine. Russia's attempts to occupy the Ukrainian shores in the Black Sea, and especially to occupy Odessa, made the Russian Navy pay a heavy price. Currently, it is known that at least 15 of Russia's warships in the Black Sea have been lost or rendered dysfunctional as a result of the brave attacks of Ukraine. And Russia is trying to restore its lost naval power in the Black Sea here. It is noteworthy that the wrecks of the Raptor-class assault boats and Serna-class landing craft sunk by Ukraine are tried to be repaired. In addition, Russia uses warships captured from the Ukrainian Navy. This situation actually reveals the helplessness of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. We will present the most comprehensive report to date, focusing on the desperation of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea by examining all of these losses in the most detailed way. Do not forget to subscribe and support us by watching until the end. The adventure of Ukraine that made the Russian Navy experience hell begins while the Russian Navy in the Black Sea was seriously weakened. At least 15 of the Russian ships in the Black Sea were eliminated by Ukraine. And these ships were not just ordinary small assault boats or small landing craft in the Black Sea. Russia's flagship Moskva, the missile cruiser equipped with state-of-the-art weapons and missiles, was sunk. The other Admiral Makarov had to be withdrawn, damaged. One of the two large landing craft was destroyed, and the other was disabled, while one amphibious warship was destroyed. At the same time, at least 5 of the Raptor-class high-speed patrol and attack boats, which were produced for use in special naval missions, were destroyed. Of the Raptor-class ships, the Russian Navy produced 17, and it was reported that 8 of them were in charge of the Black Sea Fleet. In other words, 65% of the Russian Raptor fleet in this Black Sea was eliminated by Ukraine. In addition to these, one of the newest merchant ships of the Russian Navy was eliminated recently. Let's dive deep into these losses and the desperation of the Russian Navy. Today, the Russian Navy is still the biggest navy power in the Black Sea, despite the heavy blow from Ukraine in the Black Sea. And unfortunately, it is blockading the Ukrainian coasts and may cause a great food crisis in the world. But the Russian Navy is establishing this blockade at very long distances from the Ukrainian coast. The reason for this is not a strategy, just the helplessness of the Russian Navy, because with the Ukrainian attacks around Snake Island, a big punch was dealt to the Russian Navy. Since the beginning of the war, Russia started in Ukraine. One of its main targets was always Odessa, because Odessa was the heart of Ukraine's maritime trade in the largest Portuguese. And it was also a key to cut off Ukraine's connection with the Black Sea. The Russian Navy advanced territorially simultaneously with the Russian army's advance to the east. At the beginning of March, the Ukrainian Navy's Special Marine Forces sank the Russian Raptor-class amphibious boat. This was the first blow to the Russian Navy by the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Shortly after this event in mid-March, the Russian Navy received its first major blow in the port of Berdyansk. Special Forces of the 503rd Marine Brigade and 501st Marine Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces sank 2 Serna-class landing craft and 1 amphibious warship Orks in the port of Berdyansk. This attack had exceeded the endurance of the Russian army, but the events that would bring the real hell to the Russian Navy would take place around the Snake Island of Odessa. Snake Island was captured by the Russian fleet flagship Moskva missile cruiser just after the Russian army began its ground operation. The main purpose of capturing this island was Russia's plan of landing in Odessa. With this landing, they would occupy Odessa, which could not be occupied by land operations, and completely cut off Ukraine's sea connection. But with a surprise Neptune strike missile attack, Moskva moved into the deep waters of the Black Sea. This operation needs a little more detail, because this operation both changed the balance in the Black Sea and was the first beginning of the extraordinary moves made by Ukraine. It was also the Russian Navy's biggest loss in the last century. Bayraktar DB-2, used by the Ukrainian Armed Forces, first distracted Moskva and distracted their defense systems. Later, 2 Neptune strike anti-ship missiles sent from the Ukrainian coast hit Moskva one after the other. With this blow, Moskva was shaken at first, But when it was understood that it could not be saved, the Russian army had to evacuate the ship, and as a result, the Black Sea Fleet flagship Moskva missile cruiser, Russia's most trusted ship around Snake Island, was sunk. In addition, at the end of April, the Ukrainian armed forces announced that it had hit a Serena landing craft in the area and severely damaged the Admiral Makarov missile destroyer Admiral Makarov. Like other ships in the region, docked in the port of Sevastopol to be repaired. However, it was denied by Russia that Makarov was damaged as a result of the Ukrainian attack. Subsequently, on May 6, Bayraktar DB-2 fleet struck two Raptor-class landing craft around Snake Island. Immediately afterwards, Bayraktar DB-2 armed drones struck the Russian headquarters and command center on Snake Island, as well as air defense systems. This was a very clear message to Russia, even though Snake Island was still under Russian control. The Russian Navy was now under clear threat around Snake Island. This threat was not one to be taken lightly. This was fully proven when Bayraktar DB-2 hit two Raptor-class ships again a day later. The calendars were now showing May 8th, and the Russian Navy had to withdraw its ships around the island. While these ships were coming to the Sevastopol port in Crimea, Russian submarines were sent to the region to ensure security in the region and to attack Ukraine from the sea. The airstrike operation on Snake Island on May 10th was the kind that Ukraine had not carried out for a long time. Two Ukrainian MiG-27 and Bayraktar DB-2 carried out a joint operation on the Snake Island and hit the Russian targets on the island. In this attack, it was announced that two landing craft and a helicopter on the runway were destroyed. Also in early June, Russian landing craft hiding in the Dnipro River estuary were discovered and sunk by the Ukrainian armed forces. Given these developments, the message was clear: Russian Navy ships would no longer be able to move freely along the Ukrainian coast. Trying to occupy Odessa was perhaps the biggest mistake of the Russian Navy. And it will try again. And maybe this time it will be an irreversible mistake, because now Ukraine has Brimstone missiles, especially from the United Kingdom, and Harpoon anti-ship missiles from Denmark. Russian Navy ships are currently in the blockade beyond the range of Ukrainian missiles. However, the possibility of any removal is not very likely at the moment, because even if Russia embarks on such a landing, it will completely risk the large landing ships that it has kept ready in the region. At the same time, while Russia suffered such heavy losses, the United Kingdom said that against the blockade that Russia implemented in the Black Sea, the UK warships could move to the region to escort the Ukrainian merchant ships' expeditions in the Black Sea. At the same time, the wounded Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy is so helpless that it begins to use the warships captured from Ukraine. Photos circulating online show a Ukrainian Gurza-class warship flying the Russian naval banner over Sevastopol in Russian-occupied Crimea. This photo just shows how much of an emergency the Russian Navy has fallen into. Patrol boats in the Black Sea Fleet began to run out. The boats that are the target of the Ukrainian attacks are being sunk one by one. There may be only 3 undamaged Raptors left in the Russian Black Sea Fleet today. We talked about it at the very beginning, and this is the biggest indicator of how big a loss Russia actually suffered in the Black Sea. We hope that the armed forces of Ukraine will be victorious, both on land, at sea, and in the air, and will be able to preserve the territorial integrity and freedom it deserves. The Ukrainian army has made the toughest move in the Black Sea with this move. The Russian army will not be able to shelter in the Black Sea. Ukraine has now completely cornered the Russians in this region. Russian navies are looking for a hole to escape thanks to this. Ukraine has gained the upper hand in the region. After this, Putin was surprised what to do and signed a very key decision. This situation has created a very big crisis in the Baltic. In the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army has taken some very different steps. They started to make plans for Ukraine to gain the same superiority at sea that it has achieved on land. At the beginning of this, the Black Sea, which is located on the coast of the two countries, was considered to be very important. After all, this latest move by Ukraine has completely cornered the Russian troops in the Black Sea. The Ukrainian army has recently started to go against the Russians with a different force. The biggest reason for this is the support the Ukrainian army has received. The missile and tank support sent by the United States and the European Union in succession has a great impact on this. The value of the vehicles and weapons sent to Ukraine by the US alone is estimated at $30 billion. This situation paves the way for the Ukrainian army to make great strides. Therefore, Ukraine's naval operation, which is considered to be the biggest step, has turned things completely in Ukraine's favor, and the Russian army decided to evacuate the Black Sea. The Ukrainian army first started to calculate the nature of the operation in the Black Sea while thinking about what steps the Russians would take in this region. Agents in the Russian army gave Ukraine very important information. This information was that Putin was going to launch an operation in Ukraine's port of Odessa in a short period of time, while the Ukrainian army did not let the Russians breathe due to its superiority on land. Russia searched for different ways and brought the situation to this point. After that, the Ukrainian army immediately started preparations when it learned that the Russians would direct 6 warships and 1 landing ship. It realized that this was one of the biggest invasion attempts. Immediately, the Ukrainian army took steps to put its most popular weapons on the front line and inflict the greatest damage on the Russian troops so far. The Russian army was unaware of this intelligence. The Russian army, which wanted to move directly from Odessa to Kiev, was in for a big surprise. But before this surprise, this attack was recorded as the most important attack of the Russian army so far because Russia's continued dominance in the seas was completely dependent on this attack. The Ukrainian army brought HIMARS and long-range Patriots to this region. These weapons would prevent Russian bombardments and pave the way for a counterattack. When the Ukrainian army completed its preparations, it evacuated the port of Odessa because this was the most important target of the Russians in this region. The Ukrainian army, which wanted to pack everything up without any casualties, also brought its drones to the nearby air harbor. And that's when everything got complicated, and the victory of the Ukrainian army became even clearer. The Russian army started to arrive at its ships near this area. But the ships, which were supposed to anchor for shelling, unknowingly became a target for the Ukrainian army. The Russians fired from here and began to strike one blow after another at the port of Odessa. The evacuated port of Odessa was completely destroyed. Relying on this, the Russian army began to dock its landing ships in the harbor, but the Ukrainian army did not allow it. The Ukrainian army started firing missile after missile from the HIMARS lined up along the coastline and started sinking the Russian ships. And this caused very heavy damage to the Russian army. Thanks to this damage, the Ukrainian soldiers literally cornered the Russian army while the Russian army was surprised. They gathered the urine and started to move back to Russia. That's when Ukraine's biggest surprise was revealed. The Russian army was completely destroyed by the supply. The Ukrainian army unleashed their drones and started dropping bombs on the ships. This was recorded as the most important point that ensured the victory of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army sank 3 of these ships. Thanks to this tactic, the remaining 3 ships retreated towards the Russian borders. But the Ukrainian army was not limited to this. As a result of the successive shots fired in Sevastopol harbor, it prepared the ground for all the ships in this region to be moved to a different location. And the Ukrainian army has now strategically gained complete supremacy in the Black Sea. This move by the Ukrainian army was actually seen as a historic defeat for Russia because it paved the way for more victories for the Ukrainian army and cornered the Russian army in the region. Politically, this tremendous success of the Ukrainian soldiers paved the way for Russia to lose. Then Putin heard about this great defeat. He decided to withdraw all his navies to the Baltics in order not to be squeezed anymore in Sevastopol. But a big surprise was waiting for him in the Baltics. Initially, the countries in that region were soft towards Putin, which gave him great comfort. So Putin there to bring his nuclear submarines to this region, and that completely messed things up in that region. And the Russian army was in a huge political trouble. While it is already known how far ahead the Ukrainian army is in foreign policy, Putin's absurd move has put Ukraine even further ahead because no country wanted to face a huge nuclear catastrophe. So it was quite natural for many countries to take cover against Russia. But Ukrainian soldiers started to take the victory in certain areas in this region. Countries like Norway and Denmark have started to verbalize how uncomfortable they are with Russia's activities in the region. But the comments made by the war analysts on this issue started to raise huge question marks all over the world, and all sorts of troubles have manifested themselves again. According to war analysts, the Ukrainian army is expected to win against the Russians in the near future. Behind this, it has been confirmed by the data that Russia no longer has the slightest chance against Ukraine. and the Russian army has now cornered the Russian army because of its troubles against Ukraine. The Russian army is now in a situation where it doesn't know what to do. As a result of the way things are going, if the Ukrainian soldiers had the war in a very short time, a massive evacuation is expected to begin in Russia. Not only the people fighting in the Russian army, but also the people living in Russia have started to feel very serious discomfort because of these problems of the administration. It has become very likely that Ukraine will triumph over the Russians in a very short period of time. And thanks to the surrender of many soldiers in the Russian army, things started to pull on the Ukrainian side. Ukraine's latest project has put the Russians in a very bad situation. While it is known that the Russians are cornered, thanks to Ukraine's breakthroughs in recent times, the Ukrainian army has now started to take steps in many areas. The Ukrainian army has signed a very big project for the Russians to surrender without a fight, thanks to a phone line called I Want to Live. Russian soldiers surrendered directly in this region with the surrender of thousands of Russian soldiers. The usefulness of this project was once again revealed at a time when the Ukrainian army is so far ahead. It is expected that no one will fight for the Russians. After that, the Ukrainian army will be able to win the war in every field, and this defeat of the Russian army will be very damaging for Putin's power. You can use the Super Thanks button to support our team working to bring you the latest developments in the Ukrainian war. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is cornered. Families of soldiers who were conscripted into the army with the decision of partial mobilization have started riots in many cities of Russia. The families of soldiers who were forcibly conscripted into the army and sent to fight in Ukraine want their soldiers back. Fires broke out in many regions of Russia. Russian families who gave Russian security forces a hard time created a great panic in the Kremlin palace. Vladimir Putin's decision of partial mobilization, one of the worst decisions he has ever taken, has divided the Russian people into Putin, who thought he could speed up the invasion in Ukraine by adding more troops to the army, was very wrong. Now he is paying the price of this decision. With the riots in Russia, all over Russia, Russian families and anti-war people have started to riot and organize protests for the end of Putin's regime by conscripting more than 300,000 Russian citizens into the army. Vladimir Putin failed to realize that his decision would have consequences. Unable to find soldiers to fight in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin first tried to recruit soldiers for the army by creating volunteer stands. However, when this was not enough, he sent prisoners from Russia to fight on Ukrainian soil through the Wagner mercenary company. But all this was still not enough to win the war in Ukraine. So Vladimir Putin declared partial mobilization and sent 300,000 Russian citizens to Ukraine, separating them from their families. Putin, who thought that he could win the war in Ukraine, may have gained an advantage in the war in Ukraine. But this decision seems to be leading to a bigger civil war within Russia's borders. Many war analysts have repeatedly stated that the majority of the soldiers that Putin included in the army with the decision of partial mobilization, they are chosen from the minority citizens living in Russia. As this news spread, minority citizens began to mobilize against Vladimir Putin. In addition, these minority citizens live in an autonomous republic, started to live in hiding in order not to be included in the army by Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin deployed the Russian National Guard just to include these citizens in the army. These National Guardsmen were in charge of finding and arresting minority citizens living in hiding. But the minority population who could not stand it any longer wanted to put stop to Putin's aggressive behavior. The protests that started in autonomous republics such as Crimea, Dagestan, and Chechnya are now continuing in many cities across Russia. The people who took to the streets want the soldiers sent to fight to be brought back and this war to end. As for the details of the news, Vladimir Putin's assimilation policy, which has been practiced on minority citizens in Russia for years, continues under the pretext of the war in Russia and Ukraine. Putin, who wants to reduce the number and power of minority citizens, has settled many Slavic citizens in autonomous republics in exchange for land and money. Now, when it was learned that more than 200,000 of the 300,000 Russian citizens included in the army were minority citizens, the families of minority soldiers did not remain silent. The families of these forcibly recruited soldiers are taking to the streets to protest against Vladimir Putin and call for the return of the soldiers who were taken to fight. These protests, which initially started in regions like Crimea and Dagestan, soon spread to many cities across Russia. The protests that started in St. Petersburg, the city where Vladimir Putin was born, soon gave way to chaos. Russian families opposed to Vladimir Putin and the war took to the streets to show their support for minority families and called on Putin to end the war. In a short time, the number of citizens participating in the protests reached tens of thousands, and the protests gave way to a massive civil unrest. When people started setting fire to shops and parked cars on the streets, Vladimir Putin called in the Russian security forces. When the security forces in the city of St. Petersburg proved insufficient to prevent these protests, security units were sent from neighboring cities to support them. However, the people took their anger against Putin out on the streets. People gathered in front of Vladimir Putin's party building in St. Petersburg and set fire to Putin's party building. Russian citizens threw homemade Molotov cocktails at the party building, causing the building to burn as the Molotov cocktails entered the building through the windows. A huge fire broke out, and the Russian officials in the building were quickly evacuated. Russian citizens surrounding the building stoned the vehicles of Russian officials who were evacuated from the building and tried to drive away. A large number of security forces arrived in the area and tried to quell the rioters. The protests that started early in the morning could only be suppressed late at night, and the people were dispersed. However, the aggressive behavior of the Russian security forces against their own people did not go unnoticed. The Russian people used brute force against their own citizens, beating many Russian citizens. At the same time, thousands of Russian citizens were detained. According to the latest data published by independent news channels, over 5,000 Russian citizens are said to have been detained. These aggressive attitudes that Vladimir Putin has followed, both in foreign policy and domestic politics, are highly reacted even by his own people. Putin's aggressive policies caused the anger of the Russian people towards Putin to increase even more. In the first months of the war, the number of Russian citizens who supported Putin was quite high. They supported the occupation of Ukraine and thought that this war was necessary. However, in the first months of the war, the Russian people were not yet feeling the negative conditions and economic crisis brought about by the war. As a result of the support packages provided by the US and Western countries, see Ukraine, and the embargo and sanctions imposed on Russia, both the Russian army and Russia suffered a great disappointment. Not only did the Russian army's advance on Ukrainian territory come to a halt, but the Russian economy entered a very turbulent period. Many US and Western companies have ceased operations in Russia, while many others have decided to leave. Russian citizens whose purchasing power decreased with the increase in inflation rates in Russia slowly started to feel the bad conditions brought by the war. When the losses of the Russian army in Ukraine started to be announced, the Russian people's trust in Putin completely disappeared. In addition, the explosions and fires that have occurred in Russia in the last 2 months alone have shaken the confidence of the Russian people in Putin. The majority of the Russian people think that Putin is no longer able to secure Russia's borders and that they need a regime change. The young people living in Russia are fed up with the marginalization of Russia. Many experts, researchers say that the young and rich population in Russia is starting to leave Russia. In fact, according to the latest data, it is a known fact that nearly 2 million Russian citizens left their country with the start of the war. The young population, afraid of being included in the army with the partial mobilization decision, is looking for ways to leave the country. A while ago, Vladimir Putin made a major revision in the prices of airfare tickets abroad. With the 20-fold increase in prices, people in Russia became unable to buy these plane tickets, so they would not be able to leave the country. Vladimir Putin has introduced many new decisions in order to find more citizens to enlist in the army. Citizens involved in the partial mobilization were not even allowed to leave the country without a document approved by the Russian Defense Ministry. So Russian citizens went into hiding to avoid being drafted into the army and fighting in Ukraine. But there were those who did worse than that. Russian citizens began to harm their own bodies, voluntarily breaking some parts of their bodies. This way they knew that they would not be included in the mobilization decision. Although many state leaders criticized Vladimir Putin for putting his own people in this situation, Putin continued to keep his own people under control with his dictatorial attitude.